We're going to kick off panel 4. First of all, I do want to echo something that Brian said at the top of this last panel about speaking beyond your neighbor. And so I would just like to propose, especially for people that were just here for the day, some of us are going to gather down at Fish Hawk Oyster Bar for a little impromptu happy hour at the end of this. You know, you've all got traffic, you already heard it in ways, so just wait here. And everybody's invited, and maybe that's a way to continue this conversation. And also see some of the restoration work that's happening on here and get to see this beautiful site. So with that, this final panel, which will be its common theme, Chesapeake Oyster Alliance. Yes, well, are they going to have a raw oyster bar? It's an oyster bar, so I'm going to go yes. I did see a full bar though. That's good fun. So something that we talk about a lot, Chesapeake Oyster Alliance, it's kind of theme. It's the way we ended the symposium last year. We're going to continue to do that. What's next? That's what this panel is about. We picked these 4 bright lines. Ward Slacum is online with us. Thank you, Ward, for tuning in. And no pressure, just you all just tell us what's going to happen in the future. You guys got it, right?
Yes, the crystal ball is out. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Allison Colden. I'm the Maryland Senior Fisheries Scientist with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. It's my absolute pleasure to be moderating this panel today. And yes, I'm excited. We are going to be talking about big ideas for the future from a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different viewpoints, and we hope that you all will weigh in too during our Q&A session, because everybody in this room has a really important perspective to bring to this topic. So I wanted to start this panel off by talking a little bit about where we've been. And this is the royal we. As I said, everybody in this room and everybody who is on our conference today online, you all have had some part to play in Chesapeake Bay oysters and where we are today. And so there has been an incredible amount of work done, especially over the last 2 decades or so, that have gotten to us to this point where we can have the type of conversations we're having in this room about what comes next. Next slide, please. So I lifted this slide from a presentation Stephanie Westby gave to the Sustainable Fisheries Goal Team earlier this year about where we are with respect to large-scale oyster restoration. And you've seen some of these numbers already today, but for both Maryland and Virginia, we have already completed our 10 restoration tributary plans. They are all being currently implemented. Some of them are complete. In Maryland, I think by the end of this summer, we'll have completed 4 out of the 5 tributaries in Maryland and 3 tributaries in Virginia, and are coming very, very close, 70% of that entire restoration goal. So obviously, there has been a tremendous amount of collaboration, partnership, investment, state and federal agencies leading the way on that investment as well, to bring us to a point where we can start asking these questions. How well have things worked? What can we change in the future? What do we need to bring forward as good lessons learned? Next slide, please. So I had the opportunity, this is my old slide, but that's okay. I had the opportunity to participate in a work group sponsored by NCEAS, the National Center for Environmental Analysis and Synthesis. For another acronym, it was the Science for Nature and People Partnership Work Group. And one of the results of that work group was a paper that I worked on with Brian DeAngelis and a ton of other great folks on what made the Chesapeake Bay oyster restoration effort successful. What are the social and economic factors that were weighing into that? One of them was, it was very unique for the Chesapeake Bay, is really what spurred a lot of this was an executive order. So in 2008, 2009, President Obama issued Executive Order 13508, which mandated that the federal agencies work together in partnership to restore the Chesapeake Bay. And one of the main results of that was this goal that the federal agencies all got together and said, we need to restore 20 tributaries in Chesapeake Bay by 2025. Obviously, by the time we started working on that, again, the collective we, folks realized that 20 tributaries was going to be very ambitious. And so the states and the feds then decided on 10 tributaries by 2025. And one of the other things that was really important about this, and Olivia touched on this earlier, is we had very clear metrics from the beginning. In 2011, the Oyster Success Metrics Work Group put out the report based on the best available science and input at that time as to what is a restored reef, and what is a restored tributary. So we have been able over time to very clearly communicate to the public what does success look like and how are we getting to that goal? How many reefs that have we worked on are meeting those metrics? And what we found is that those types of clear, measurable, and metrics that you can communicate to the public have been really important in getting the buy-in and the support, not only of the public, but of decision makers who have to, appropriate funds to support these types of programs. Similarly, there is something to be said for a good tagline. 10 by 2025 is something that sticks with people. It's easy to remember, it's easy to understand. We start talking about things like we should and we will further on in the presentation about nitrogen removal and ecosystem services. All of those things are really important co-benefits that we need from oyster restoration, but it's just a little bit harder to package than 10 by 2025. Next slide. So again, the other things that we have benefited from through this restoration effort are these really targeted research programs, which have been supported by the state, supported by federal agencies and others. And we have learned so much from these restoration programs about ecosystem services, about how to construct oyster reefs. For a long time, there was the thought that Chesapeake Bay oyster restoration could not work. And it took an entirely different approach of really focusing on large scale, focusing on one place at a time, as opposed to Johnny Appleseed type of projects all over the bay. And I think that's something that we can take into the future and consider as we move into this next era of what comes up for oysters. So I wanted to put this up here. This are the two oyster outcomes from the 2014 Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. And I wanted to remind everyone of these because this is one of the very few Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement outcomes which is likely to be met. And that is a tremendous accomplishment for everyone within the restoration community. But it also means that this community and the folks living in this room are a very small group of Chesapeake Bay restoration practitioners who will have the opportunity to say, what is the next goal? A lot of the other folks working on wetlands, for example, just need to complete the goal that they have and they're working towards. We have the opportunity to define an entirely new goal for oysters. So it's a very exciting time moving towards 2025. Next slide. So a couple of things I'm hoping our panel will touch on this afternoon, and we have talked a little bit about today already, is what is the role of industry, both aquaculture and wild harvest, in helping in the recovery efforts for oysters in the Chesapeake Bay? What I've discussed so far is all taking place in oyster sanctuaries. And we know that a lot of the operations that both aquaculture and wild harvest do to support their own industries are very similar to the types of methodologies that we're using in restoration. So what are those methodologies? What are those best practices, and how can they contribute to the overall picture of recovering the oyster population? A couple other things that I think are really exciting that are on the horizon. What role does coastal resilience and projects supporting coastal resilience play? In Maryland in particular, the majority, if not all, of our reefs in large-scale restoration are subtidal oyster reefs. And while a lot of these coastal resilience projects may not have as broad a footprint as we're able to do in the subtidal areas, think about all of the tremendous opportunity that's out there with the acreage, cumulative acres of reef habitat that we have in the intertidal. Next slide. There's also additional opportunities that are out there, and this has been touched on already today as well, for incorporating different funding strategies and funding streams and partnerships into oyster recovery. So there have been several BMPs developed and more on the way relating to nutrients. So what role do oysters play in the larger Chesapeake Bay pollution diet? Next slide. And lastly, we have these innovative partnerships. We are all in the room today and brought together by the Chesapeake Oyster Alliance, and that just recognizes that we have this very broad and diverse group of folks who are interested in oysters, and how do we best leverage all of those different perspectives and interests in oysters to really push forward the next the next stage of oyster restoration. So with that, next slide. I'm happy to introduce Brent. He's the Tidal Programs Manager for Friends of the Rappahannock, and he is our first speaker this afternoon. Brent.
Thank you very much, Allison. Much appreciated. Like you said, my name is Brent Huntsinger, Tidal Programs Manager, based out of the Rappahannock office. So I will admit that right now I am drinking through a fire hose of oyster restoration and everything oysters. I'm here, I'm not a scientist by trade. I am much more on the collaboration and partnership side. And so that's what I'll be speaking with you all today. The partnerships in individual tributaries across the lower watershed that Friends of the Rappahannock has been trying to build with all our partners. And then at the end, we'll share a little bit more currently about how we're going to try and take that to an economy of scale, hopefully in the next couple of years with some new financial support. So truly at the heart of everything that Friends of the Rappahannock does is community collaboration. We can't really do anything on our own, and we our philosophy is to work through our partners, whether that's government, nonprofits, PDCs, planning district commissions, and everyone else, other nonprofit groups as well. So this is actually a picture. There's the tides, and then on the lower left is the Kellum reef, which W. Kellum worked with us on, putting down a bunch of shell on that, I guess twice now, 2015 and 2019, I believe. And a couple of the pictures from Matt Ogburn's presentation earlier was on that reef yesterday afternoon with that sonar technology. So next, please. So this is somewhat new. Like I said, we have, and this is by no means the only partners, but these are what the newly minted Rappahannock River Oyster Restoration Partnership is a group of local seafood companies, schools, private and public schools, nonprofit organizations, and other partners. And we are working through the successes and I'll call them learning opportunities and oyster restoration and associated community outreach in several tributaries. So that would be the Nature Conservancy, CERC, FOR, Steamboat Wharf Oyster Company, who's here today, the Tides in the Bay Foundation, and then W. Kellum in the Carters Creek area, and then Shore and Ruark, which is owns Urbana Seafood over in the Urbana Creek area as well. Next, please. So a little bit more of a local before we get up to the regional scale is Restore Urbana Creek Initiative. Is a initiative. Is the feedback a little bit too much if I try and change my switch my Is that better? A little bit. Okay. So the Restore Urbana Creek Partnership is a consortium of groups that has been working to restore Urbana Creek and its oyster beds and its oyster reef for quite a few years now. And at the very basis of that is the Urbana Oyster Festival Foundation. As everyone knows or doesn't know, Urbana is the home to Virginia's largest oyster festival every year, coming up in about 5 weeks, where 30,000 people descend on a town of about 500 overall. So, and that's the Chesapeake Bay Governor School, who's really does a lot of monitoring and monitors the biodiversity and water quality in the creek. Greenfin Studio here helps out with a lot of the, I guess, marketing and other pieces of that as well. If I'm correct, Christchurch School, and then HRSD, the Bay Foundation, and all the partners you can see there, Middlesex County, Shore and Ruark, and NIFWF has been a big funder of that work throughout the time. So we are going to be doing a little bit more work in Urbana Creek here in the next few weeks, putting about hopefully 3,000 bushels of shell down on one of the leases in the creek as well. And you'll see a few photos of that in a second. So next. So this is pictures of, on the left, kind of, that's shell, or that's the result of restoration that has happened in the last 7 years. We also work with Lee Walton Seafood, that big mound of shell there, working with schools. That's an educational program and outreach where they loaded up shell. We did a rotation stations educational day with them, where they did everything from loading the shell all the way to planting that shell on and learning about it as well on the FOR boat that we had that some of you all were on yesterday, as well as we had a very low tide event in March of this year, where I had a NIFWIF liaison out with me to show him the reef that we were working on to sew up one of those grants. And it just so happened that the tide was so low that the bottom right picture is, we literally got to see, we never get to see the reef like that. So that restored piece of that reef was amazing. We were able to pick those oysters up and show them to our liaison, which was really nice to see. As we've seen, we don't often get to see our handiwork with that clarity and that kind of access every day. So next. So another thing we've been working on a little bit in the creek, in the backs of the creek, oyster sill living shorelines. So these are oyster bags that are placed kind of in a linear fashion along the edges. And so we are about done. It's about 400 linear feet that we've built. Actually, just two of us. It's been a lot of fun. Little muddy, you can see down there at the end, but has been quite, eventually we'll be adding some more sand on there and replanting a little bit, and that'll be done hopefully by November. So a little bit different piece of an oyster habitat combined with the living shoreline to prevent some of the undercutting. So there's a little bit of a hybrid piece here between living shorelines and oyster habitat restoration as well. Next. Shell installation on a reef. We signed an MOU with a property owner in Urbana Creek, and then worked with Shore and Ruark to come out and apply shell on a portion of that lease, and we will be finishing that or applying another section of shell on that in the coming weeks as well, and that's kind of that 3,000 bushels that we'll be putting down. Next. So that brings us over to this side of the river here, Clean Carters Creek. We'll show you some photos, and so some of our partners here, Greenfin, W. Kellum, the Dog and Oyster, we've started to recycle shell with the Dog and Oyster, which is a oyster bar just out in a micro vineyard just down the road from here. The tide's in, as you know, you have been speaking with Will Smiley a bunch, and then the Bay Foundation as well, obviously. So this was a lease donation by Mr. Kellum. And we've also had another donation of a 20-acre reef recently by a local citizen as well that we'll be looking to restore a little bit of here in the coming months. Shell recycling, like I said, and then outreach and education, especially in the creek with Chesapeake Academy, which is a local school right down the road from here. Next. So an example of some of the restoration that has been done in the last 7 years. I think that speaks for itself. All shell and spat on shell being put down, whether it's by bushel basket or larger amounts with water cannon. Right there will be used. Going forward, I believe we'll probably be trying to use all stone in the coming couple of years for our restoration here in the creek. Next. The Tides in Partnership. This is so on the bottom left and to the left there is a really cool, they're called Tidal reefs. And those are made by a company out of Charlottesville. It's kind of an innovative product, entrepreneurial product that's being created. You can see the holes, you can plant grasses into the holes in that type of reef there. So we're working with the Tides in on trying those along the edges. Some of you all helped install 50 of those yesterday, right down at the reef down here on low tide. We were looking at them. So the hope is, that we'll be able to see how they do in the coming years as well. Actually, and then recently, Oyster Seed Holdings was good enough to donate 600,000 spat to us. So those we are going to be putting out on the creek right now, a little bit, the larger ones. So those will kind of the larger size, and then we're going to grow the rest out to be used on our reefs next year and in the coming years as well. Also working with schools to create oyster sentinels, the upper right-hand side there. And then whenever we have a little bit of leftover shell, we like to make Will happy. So you can see he was very happy to have his shell there on the bottom. Mm-hmm. Next. And then also we work with CBF, the oyster gardening folks. Every year we host at our June Parker Marina. This was in July, just the Oyster Gardener Program, where volunteer oyster gardeners, landowners come deliver their spattle and shell that they've grown out the previous year, and they receive their other spattle and shell, their new stuff, to take back and grow there. So it's a regional approach, and we are lucky enough to work with CBF on that regional site, and they're also good enough to give us that spattle and shell, which we bring to Urbana Creek recently to put that on our reefs there. So yet another kind of great partnership as part of the Rappahannock partnership. Next. So aquaculture partners, currently we have two main ones that we will be working with by large, and this by no means limited, but two of the companies are Steamboat Wharf. We hold some paddles where we go out. They have this great place over by Maratico where you can literally walk or paddle out to their lease and eat oysters, and people can learn and have a great day of paddling as well as Rogue Oyster Company, which is out of Greenville Marina. And so we work with them on a variety of events kind of all across the watershed as well. Culpeper all the way down to here. Next. And then bringing the work to scale, I know I'm out of time. So bringing the work to scale, we've received new funding from NIFWIF. We recently found out, and so those are the partners on this. We'll be working with CERC to do some pre and post monitoring. And then frankly, we're going to be using or mining the Nature Conservancy. Andy, wherever you are, will be providing us with a lot of knowledge about things that have worked, things that have not worked, especially in the Pianktang River. And then so going forward, we will be working with all these partners to try and install 20 acres of reef. We'll see. Kind of depends on with inflation how far the money will go. So that remains to be seen. Next. And that's kind of our timeline: pre-restoration monitoring, planning, and growing. And then 2024 is where the rubber really hits the road, and we will hopefully get all that material into the river and accelerate some of the reef restoration in the tributaries here, and then in another park just off Belle Isle State Park on a larger lease that we have there. So with that, I think that's all I have. Next, that's our contact information. Like, thank you to COA and the Tides, as well as I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Jen and Libby in the back, who are two of our staff. They are oyster science nerds, and without them, I would be totally not lost. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you so much, Brent. I think that is a great example of how to a different sort of framework, more of a bottom-up rather than a top-down approach to restoration. So good ideas for the future there. Our next speaker is going to be Ward Slacum. He's the Executive Director of the Oyster Recovery Partnership, who is joining us online. So Ward, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Thanks, Allison. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, and sorry I couldn't be there with you, but I do appreciate the opportunity to talk about large-scale oyster restoration in Maryland and give some perspectives on that. The previous talk was excellent, a lot of good pictures, and you won't see that in my talk, so be prepared. But I'm really excited to talk about this, and I'll also to Andrew Budden's point, there was I think a preliminary title for this talk that has changed a little bit, although I will talk a little bit about alternate substrates and the need for that. But the emphasis of this talk is to give some perspective on at least how at ORP, Oyster Recovery Partnership, we have viewed and sort of been a part of ramping up in Maryland to large scale operations. And I'll talk a little bit about challenges and opportunities going forward based on our perspectives. Okay, so next slide, please. Great. So large scale, basically want to give some idea of how we got here, at least from our perspective. And I think it's helpful to define how we define large scale, and that is producing enough oysters to enhance or restore about 100 acres of subtidal oyster reefs annually. Maryland, Andrew touched on this, Maryland and Virginia, they sort of have similar strategies of oyster restoration, and that they're basically focused on the three sectors of oyster production: the public fishery, aquaculture, and the sanctuary restoration. ORP is fortunate to be able to support Maryland's Department of Natural Resources with implementing the oyster production components of each one of these states' oyster sectors so that they satisfy the department restoration goals. The approaches to produce oysters for each of the sectors can vary, but in Maryland, they all use hatchery-produced spat-on shell as a component of their oyster production strategy. And the sanctuary program is almost solely dependent upon spat-on shell. So there's a difference biologically between Virginia and Maryland, in that in Maryland we're spat limited, we're recruitment limited, and we're also shell limited. So for a very long time we've been focused on using spat-on shell as a mechanism to produce oysters in every one of the three major oyster production sectors. And so what I'm hoping to do is use the graph that's on the screen to kind of emphasize how we got to large-scale restoration. And Allison touched a little bit about this in terms of the policies that went into to kind of ramp up large-scale restoration in Maryland, but basically going to use the line to emphasize how we evolved to large-scale restoration. This graph, what it does is it captures the number of spat-on shell produced over time from a cumulative perspective. And on the line, I've added some specific actions or activities that have aided in the evolution of large-scale operations in Maryland. The y-axis of the graph shows billions of bushels of spat-on shell, and the x-axis is time, and the time span is the better part of 30 years. These data, they're basically cumulative spat that's been produced and documented or maintained by Horn Point Lab and the Oyster Recovery Partnership. Most of the spat on the slide have been planted in sanctuaries, but there are a couple, if you look on the slide, there are some red stars that show when aquaculture spat on shell production has been put into this line, and then also in 2015 when the public fishery, at least as ORP manages it, basically started to add to this data set. And again, this is really an ORP and Horn Point hatchery data, but this really does capture the majority of spat on shell production over that 30-year time series. So to give you some examples of why this is important, there were things like technology advancements that contributed to starting to get to a large scale production of oysters and for restoration in Maryland. There were also supportive policies. To go down around 2003, you'll see one of the major technology advances was the construction of the Horn Point hatchery. Then again in 2009, that's when the Horn Point hatchery's setting pier came into play. And then over time, again, some supportive policies like the executive order and the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, all of those combined really allowed us to leverage the resources needed to ramp up to our current large scale activities. Next slide, please. So a series of actions occurred over a 30-year time frame that were used to leverage resources needed to advance large scale. The growth to large scale has also created some challenges that are, some obvious future challenges that need to be addressed if we want to continue large scale operations. So are the resources available to maintain the pace? Funding, initiatives, and how do we maintain the momentum? Will that continue? I won't focus on that in this discussion, but I will focus on an immediate need, which is that alternate substrate piece that I talked about earlier. But one of the major resources, because of the reliance of spat on shell in Maryland, is shell. The graph that's on this slide shows the amount of bushels of shell that are used each year for the 3 oyster production sectors in Maryland. And again, these are from ORP's data that we maintain. It doesn't necessarily capture all of the shell that's consumed annually for all 3 of the sectors. within Maryland, but it's likely the majority of the shell that's used. And these are just stacked histograms with the bushels of shell on the left axis and from 2017 to 2021 on the bottom axis. What's in blue is the shell that's used for spat-on shell production in the sanctuaries. What's in orange is what we manage for the public fishery. So that's a combination of loose shell deployed to enhance reefs, and then also a combination of spat-on shell or the shell that's used to produce spat-on shell for those reefs as well. And then what's in gray at the top of each bar is aquaculture, the amount of shell that's contributed to aquaculture that ORP manages. If you remove the 2019 low salinity production year and then the year of COVID in 2020, what you can see is sort of a general trend that over time, we're starting to see that there's an increased demand for shell. This has been discussed in various groups for a very long time, but at this point, it's starting to become a point where we have these three sectors that are now competing for a limited resource. And that limited resource is also controlled by few sources, and it's becoming costly. Okay, so next slide, please. One approach to resolve the shell dilemma is to evaluate alternatives to shell. And that can be that alternatives to shell that can be used in place of shell in the spat production process. The good news is that there is already a body of work that has already sort of summarized some of the sources of alternate shell and looked at how those promote growth. So we're not basically starting from scratch. Obviously, there's work that's being done in Virginia that Andrew alluded to, and that's very helpful. But what's in this table that's on the screen is from a recent review paper that was published in 2020 that summarized specific attributes of several alternate shell alternatives to shell. And the paper basically represents a subset of the information that's out there, but it gives a good framework to conduct a robust assessment of what types of alternate substrates might be available that we can use in place of shell. That paper, what's nice about the paper is it looked at things like settlement and recruitment of each specific material, looked at the abundance and density and biomass and growth, and then there was an economic component. So what was the cost of each one of these materials to be used? So at least in Maryland, and obviously there's ongoing research and work that's occurring in Virginia, and then through research institutions that's looking into this issue. But we're embarking on an evaluation now to try to understand what materials can work, what materials are available, and what can be used in place of shell, if possible. Okay, next slide. So I just want to wrap this up with some future opportunities, and I'll say, without struggle, there would be no progress, and so the shell availability challenge, it's also an opportunity. And so I was encouraged again by the lightning round talk. I think there was a talk about someone who had already sort of synthesized an alternate shell type, and then also Andrew, who indicated that stone is being used in Virginia. But I think we need to promote research to conserve shell and look into alternates to shell going forward, specifically in Maryland. It should be a priority. And then I brought back that same slide with the spat-on shell production. And I want to emphasize again that through the process of growth to get to large scale, the other two sectors in Maryland, not the restoration sector, but aquaculture and the public fishery, they have benefited through training and through experimentation that has occurred, and they have learned how to produce spat-on shell and they've learned, practices and techniques that have come out from that. So we also need to basically, and this really wasn't part of the beginning, but I think it's where we need to go. We need to start to develop basin-wide goals and objectives. We've basically learned how to restore tributary scale, but I think we can move now to the basin-wide scale, which makes sense because all three sectors in Maryland would be operational at the basin scale. And to give an example of what a basin, it's Eastern Bay. An example would be Eastern Bay, where there are multiple tributaries in a very large basin where all three sectors occur. And then as we develop those goals, I would suggest that we engage all three sectors to be part of those goal setting activities. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Ward. And I'm very happy we got that word. All right, our last speaker on the panel today is Tommy Kellum, and you've heard his name a lot this afternoon, talking about collaborations. And so, Tommy, please take it away.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Again, my name is Tommy Kellum. I'm with W. Kellum Seafood. We're a fifth generation oyster processor located just about 1.5 miles down the creek here, right at the mouth of Carter's Creek. Very fortunate to have been in this industry and very passionate about it. Andrew will tell you he's been on both sides of my passion. So, at any rate, we've heard a real quick story. You've heard the term oyster farm a lot here today, and about 26, 27 years ago, Stan Allen visited our office to come in and talk about a new technology called triploid aquaculture. And my dad was in the office, and he just kind of overheard and listened. Stan left, and Stan had talked about how we could, about the triploid technology that he had developed and how we could use triploids to enhance our oyster farm. So when Stan walked out, Dad said, well, will somebody get that fellow straight that we grow corn, wheat, and beans on the farm, and we grow oysters on the shore. So it's a thing, you don't hear the term oyster farm a lot in our operation, but at any rate. Presently, our company, we do about 100,000 bushels of oysters to be shucked per year. We're doing about 30,000 bushels of half shell. We're a poster child of Andrew's chart that he had up earlier. About 83% of what we do is traditional, conventional wild harvest. About 17% is aquaculture, spout on shell, and cage culture. So we don't differentiate a lot from what Andrew had as far as the makeup of our company. So we heard earlier about talking about the past as we're looking to the future. My involvement in the industry started right about here, 1996. And to give you an idea of where we were at that point in time, we were purchasing 7,100 bushels total of private and wild oysters in the state of Virginia at that time. A total Virginia harvest that year was just south of 15,000 bushels, and we were working with Dr. Allen. We had 60 cages of triploid Debbie strain Virginica oysters down by the Rappahannock River Bridge. And the first year we were at about a 60% mortality with 90% dermo infection. And at that same time, on our wild beds, we were at about a 96% dermo infection. And a typical year for us off our private beds in the Rappahannock was somewhere in the 800 to 900 bushel range. To give you an idea, we harvested about 750 bushels out of the Rappahannock last week. So we've come a long ways. Next slide. So about 1997, I got a call from Rob Brumbaugh wanting to know if he and Joe Maroon from the Bay Foundation could come to the office and have a conversation about what major oyster restoration could look like. And in the process of doing so, we caught the attention of a state, of our federal Senator John Warner and our Congressman Herb Bateman, and kind of wrapped them into the conversation. And what came out of it was we had I guess probably the first oyster symposium in Virginia. It was held at a church here in Weems across the creek. There weren't a lot of environmental partners at that time. It was just prior to TNC getting involved, so it's pretty much the Bay Foundation, BMRC, and Virginia industry effort. This is the document that came out of that. When I was looking through this information, trying to find it, to give you an idea how long ago this was, the directions to the church were mailed out, and this document was faxed to everyone. So, you know, when I look at this and then start talking about collaboration, we started off at 0, and you know, a lot of these goals that we came up with at the time, none of that's really changed. I mean, we're still pretty much looking at the same things we were looking at then. You heard from Ron earlier, as we got started, you know, the industry was sort of I guess, the bait that was used to start pulling money in because of the jobs and the economy and the infrastructure that was in place at the time. So one of the thoughts that came out of this meeting was that we would start including federal partners like NOAA and the Corps and all these folks that had the resources and the magnitude to really tackle a large-scale oyster restoration. Andrew's predecessor's budget at the time was about $1 million for everything, so it was obvious that Virginia didn't have the money to try to tackle this problem. Next slide. So we got started off. The first thing was there wasn't even infrastructure in the state as far as equipment to even do large scale restoration. So at the advice, or I would say at the discretionary advice of our accountant, we jumped out on a limb at Kellum Seafood and purchased a boat that was repurposed for oyster replenishment. That year when we did that, there was about 800,000 bushels of house shell available in the state of Virginia for deployment. Unfortunately, at that time, the profit for an oyster company like ours was essentially your shell pile at the end of the year. We were handling 90,000 sacks of Gulf oysters a year, shucking them, and essentially the profit was selling the shell back to the restoration program. That's how bad things were. So at any rate, we came in with a boat and started partnering with the federal partners. The first one, next slide, was a project with the Corps that we did here in the lower Rappahannock. And most of the success that our family and the Virginia watermen have seen in the Rappahannock, I give full credit to this project. We sat down in what we call the Virginia Oyster Heritage Project, and the Corps, NOAA, all the federal partners, BMRC, CBF, at this point TNC had come in, and we drew what at the time was a very elaborate replenishment project for the lower part of the Rappahannock River that consisted of a number of sanctuary reefs that were 3D reefs that we put broodstock on, and then we just put shell around the outside of them, 2D, that was going to recruit the larvae, and that was going to be the harvest areas. And the interesting part of this at the time was it was my job to sell it to the watermen that we were going to put a complete moratorium on the Rappahannock while we did this work. And I sat in front of the Virginia Watermen's Association and explained to them this was going to be great, but that we weren't going to have any harvest in this area for about 5 years. And I got everything from how ashamed my grandfather would be at me to you'll never buy another oyster from me again. So by the end of it, we had pretty good buy-in from the watermen. This project was the first that we did. Next slide. And we employed a lot of the outside watermen that were out of work. Our company logo is actually, this was a project we did on that oyster restoration heritage project. the brood stock, we were, the hatcheries weren't up to speed. We didn't have access to a lot of brood stock. So we went to an area in the lower part of the Rappahannock that we were going to plant shell and build a reef, and actually dredged up what little bit of brood stock and live oysters that were there. We dredged them up and actually transported them and deployed them on top of the sanctuary reef. This was at the time, one of the last 5 boats on the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia portion from Tangier. We employed local watermen that were out of work, and then another boat that we had here to dredge this up and deploy it. So next slide. The funny thing is, when you go look at the budget we had then, all of this work, what we spent was just a little over $1 million. That included the monitoring. That was everything that went into this. And where I see this tying into the future, about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years after we completed this project, we started having harvest. The industry started getting sideways with our federal partners. All of a sudden it was like, well, all right, we've done this work. Now we need to back off on the harvest. And we were getting pressure through BMRC from the federal partners that we were going at the harvest a little too strong. And some of the work that was being done was not done in the best areas and so forth. So poaching became the #1. And poaching occurs, no question. It occurs on my bottom, it occurs on public trust bottom, it occurs. But all of a sudden, the industry and poaching got to be the bad guy, and the poaching was the reason nothing was working. And unfortunately, the industry just, our feeling through the Virginia Seafood Council, all of a sudden, okay, you caught us out when you need money, but once you got the money and we got all these partners and all this interest and all this money, put us back in the closet. So we went through a period of time where we did not have the cooperation that we should have had in the Commonwealth, all pushing in a positive direction. I feel like we're over that now. BMRC did a tremendous job, Andrew and his predecessor, Jim Wesson, of sort of trying to pull everyone back in the same room and get everyone back on the same page. But at the end of the day, all of the work, I would say, has been a tremendous success. The number of jobs, next slide, I'm gonna jump ahead here a little bit, but what next slide? The work that we created for a lot of the watermen and so forth was a part of this. Next slide. Go ahead, next one. So if someone had told me when we started these projects back in, the early 2000s, that we would get to a point we are here. This is in the Pianki River. This was seed that we were dredging up. Essentially, you're looking at about somewhere in the 3,000, 2,500, 3,000 bushel of seed here. If someone had told me when we started this effort that we'd be able to do this, I'd say it was impossible. I mean, it's a huge feat to get where we've gotten. Next slide. So going back to, sort of the success we had, this was the first season that we opened up the Rappahannock after the moratorium was lifted from the work that we did with the Virginia Oyster Heritage Project. It's approximately about 50 oyster boats that just at our company that came in. These were independent watermen that sold us the oysters. This was the first time anyone said, well, maybe this was the right thing to do, or that was a pretty good idea, or what have you. But at that point, all of a sudden, that fleet of boats and what was going on was driving about 800 jobs. A trucking company in the lower part of Virginia, oyster shuckers. All of a sudden, we started producing dollars for the dollars that were spent. So going back to the future thing, and then here, conclusion, as I've gotten older and I guess kind of reflect on things, I think we're at a point that if we can pull together as partners, as long as Mother Nature cooperates, and I do buy into Andrew's theory. I'm on the heaven side of things. That's where I am. And as long as the good Lord cooperates, I think we're in a good place. And I think it's a good time to do more of what we're doing here today in a collaboration of where we're at with technology now and where we go forward. But I would ask that everyone consider that the industry be a partner in that. One of the advantages of that, I think Andrew could attest to this, companies like ours that do restoration work can do it for fractions of what large-scale outside contractors do. And that's a multitude of reasons. We have the equipment. We don't have to make money doing oyster restoration, hopefully. And our goal is to make our money on what comes from that. But there are a lot of advantages to working with industry. And I think it's incumbent on industry to also reciprocate. And we've tried to do more of that lately. Our partnership with Friends of the Rappahannock, it's really neat. This lease that we proffered to Friends of the Rappahannock here was actually one of my great-grandfather's leases. And it hadn't worked like I thought it would. I thought we don't have competitors in the oyster business anymore because there's so few of us. We call ourselves co-opetition. But at any rate, I thought that we would start seeing other companies that had leases that were, you know, what's the acre? I don't know the exact number. We're probably somewhere around 3,600 acres of leases. You know, what's an acre of prime ground to set aside for something like the work these guys are doing? So if we're trying to put our money where our mouth is, and now that we're in a position to do it, actually contribute and be a better part of restoration. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you so much, Tommy, for that perspective. And it just, that just struck me because the acreage that your company holds is half of all of the acreage in Maryland. So obviously there's opportunities for growth and industry partnerships into the future. So I want to kick off our last panel Q&A session. If there are any questions in the room, please raise your hand. But first, Paula, do we have any questions from our online audience?
Yeah, 4 questions online. Let's see. The first one is, not sure who it's to. Might be Friends of Rappahannock and Brent, but why not use crushed limestone instead of shell? It works just as well, as less expensive, and may last longer on reef.
I'll just repeat the question. So why not use crushed limestone instead of shell?
I don't know that I can answer. I'm going to use whatever the MRC says we should use, as well as Mr. Kellum and our partners. So why limestone versus granite or granite stone? I maybe would prefer to you to answer that question.
Thank you. Number one, it's the approval process. Number two, we're very fortunate in our area of Virginia to have granite quarries that are not too far away. Limestone, we're looking at the Valley of Virginia and some of the other areas, and the trucking and so forth gets to be more of an issue for us here in the central lower part of the bay, more so than in other areas. So I would, and I think Andrew would be a better expert to that answer than I, but that would be my initial response.
Another online question.
Sure. Tommy, again, how would you explain the increase in both private and public harvest land starting around 2010? Do you think it was the result of environmental conditions, new growth, harvest methods, the process that you presented, or others? Not the question Brian Pat.
Thanks for the question. Great question. It's a multitude of factors there. The one thing that we saw as a common point, we talked about this a lot because, you know, we could go the other way just quickly. Hurricane Isabel, prior to that, we had salinities averaging about 27 parts here in the middle Rappahannock, say at the Rappahannock River Bridge. Any of you guys came in that way. Post Isabel and it started with Tropical Storm Floyd, but we watched the salinities get down in the 16, 17 range to yesterday. Most of areas in here were around 16 and a half, something in that range. I think the lower part of the Rappahannock now is 20. So I attribute it to the environmental factors. I hope it's resistance. I hope we've developed the amount of resistance we think we have to dermo and MSX, and I would have to defer to the VIM folks on that. But I think salinity's got a lot to do with it, and obviously the restoration work is a huge part of it too.
Any questions in the room? Go ahead, Rob.
I just wanted to give at least my perspective on limestone is that, to me, the jury was out when we were looking at that as an alternative substrate. Some of it wasn't working well at all, other parts were, and we think that it may have been due to the fact that some of the limestone doesn't quite have the crevices or the structure really that you get from oyster shell or granite and so on. So I would want to be pretty careful to see whether or not you want to use limestone.
Yeah, I just want to quickly summarize that for folks who are online. Ron Lucius from VIMS was just providing some commentary about limestone and the structure of it. And so that might be some of the reasons for why limestone operates differently from the differences in which. Time for one last question?
Sure. Let's see. This one's for Ward, if he can answer, if he's not muted. Question for Ward, is there any effort to use northern quahog or ocean shell to augment oyster shell base?
We know that shell source is available, and it's been used in some of Maryland's restoration, primarily in the past to build the base of a reef before spat-on shell gets deployed. The biggest challenge with those sources is the cost to transport those sources down to where we need that shell.
All right, thank you so much to all of our speakers and for all of you sticking out for our last panel of the day.
Thanks, Allison.
Okay, we made it. It is very, very hard to summarize 25 brilliant presentations, so many great questions. So I won't. I would just like to give all of our speakers one more round of applause. In the course of pulling together an agenda like this, you really get to, it's stunning how many individuals, the deep well of talent of people working for, in and for the Chesapeake Bay Oyster. I really hate to, kind of end by stating the obvious, but there is so much extremely detailed science, hard work, next level collaboration, and happening here. And we're really witnessing a global success story in real time. I would say though, it's going to take all of us, everybody on Zoom, everybody else that didn't tune in today, and the public at large to continue to defend and meet these goals, and if not exceed these goals. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you one more time to all of our speakers, to the Friends of the Rappahannock, to Greenfin Studio, Mission Control over here, to the Tides in our host, and to all of you for joining us today and for all of your hard work. Thank you very much.